Oh,
Oh,
there we go.
we're live.
Cool. Good afternoon. Happy 3:15, everyone. Atlantic time. We are back with another episode of Silent Fire Live. We've had a bit of a kind of a weird fall. It's been busy and we've spent some time away, and so we've not been as consistent as we might like to be with these live episodes. And today was another busy day, and that's why we're not actually in the same room, even though you might think Josh is just in another part of this room, or I'm in
Yeah,
another
just
part of that
the
room.
bookcase just extends.
That's right. But we are at our respective homes and our respective studies, and we're able to come live to everyone today. So, but today we're here to talk about a topic for today, I should say, is monasticism. That's a topic that is interesting because we're both from traditions, or in traditions at any rate, that have a bit of I guess, a different relationship to monasticism, to monastics, to asceticism, and by which I mean, these practices don't really perhaps make up the core of who we are, the way it might for the Orthodox or the Roman Catholics and that
Right.
sort of thing, for whom there
Especially
are
the Orthodox, for sure.
especially the Orthodox.
Yeah.
And so, however, what we're here to talk about today is explore the ways in which perhaps those themes and monasticism can actually, or are actually, parts of our own tradition. So we'll kick it off today. We do encourage you, as you watch. I think we're live on Facebook and YouTube today.
That we are.
We are. So if you're wherever you are, like, share, subscribe, send it to a friend, and comment too. We see all your comments come up.
Yeah, that's right.
In the sidebar here. So comment if you have questions or anything to add, or if you disagree with us vehemently, we'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, that's right.
And if you're watching this episode later on, then likewise comment on YouTube or Facebook, and we'll make sure to get back to you. So to start it off, I want to just ask, I guess, Josh, when we should try and define monasticism before we start talking about it, because that's a word that not everyone may know, people who are watching this. So when we say the word monastic or monasticism,
Right.
it's what comes to your mind. What are we talking about?
Yeah, and I mean, I know, like, it can conjure any kind of image to like lots of different assumptions about that. You can think of people wearing orange robes in Tibet on a mountain.
Right.
It can conjure up old druidic type of customs and things like that. I mean, there's all kinds of different connotations that the term monastic itself can bring up. The same, funny enough, it's the same with the term God. All kinds of connotations that word can bring up. And it's not, I'm not equating the two. No. But the term monastic, we were just talking about this beforehand, so I busted out my book. This is a really fun one, the Mater Icon. It's a collection of sayings from early church women that were really influential. But in the intro, it talks about the root word for monasticism, and the term it's monoastic is the compound word for the Greek. Mono, of course, being alone. That's a pretty simple one. Singular, alone. But the term that there was a word, where was it? I just had it up here. Naturally, I lost it. The term itself is askeo, and what askeo means. The term askeo, which, like I said, I just had up here, but I turned it to the wrong page. Here we go. The term askeo in the Greek literally means to take care of something. So right. Mono, to be single or alone, and to take care of something. And so the idea was, what you're taking care of is your salvation, your connection with the Lord, with God, with Christ, with the Father. So you are alone and taking care of this thing. So that was really the root of what it meant to be a monastic. And there wasn't, in terms of the Christian world anyway, prior to, you can look through just the history of the monastic movement. A lot of historians would trace its root back to the Essenes, the Jewish sect called the Essenes. John the Baptist was one of those, where they would live in the wilderness and live a very ascetical lifestyle. the term asceticism, meaning deriving from askeo and literally meaning to take care of something. And so the lifestyle was fasting, rhythms of prayer, spending time in silence and solitude, seeking God, doing acts of kindness and service, things of that nature. And you look at John the Baptist was, of course, a classic example of that. And so a lot of the Christian monastics would see their inspiration from probably three main figures in Scripture: Elijah, John the Baptist, and Jesus. All three of them having spent significant time in the wilderness. And then you've got the Moses a little bit here, but Moses was really vocationally involved as a shepherd in the wilderness, less so alone, not really understanding what to do, seeking God and being confused about how to move forward. Like, I mean, Elijah spent 2 significant bouts of time in the wilderness. John the Baptist dedicates his time in the wilderness. Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness and then continually retreats to the wilderness. So the early monastics would find their inspiration from there, and the original, of course, was Anthony the Great. But the term, to me, the term monastic, having studied it now, I'm trying to put myself in 2 frames of mind, right? Raised in the Evangelical Church, charismatic church, the term monastic was a very foreign term. It was not something that was necessarily normal to church life. There was no conversation around, if you were vocationally to be involved in ministry, it was to be a pastor, or a worship leader, or maybe itinerant in the sense of traveling around and that kind of thing.
Right.
But in the evangelical charismatic wing of the church that I grew up in, there was no value for monasticism. It was very, very disconnected from that. And so it may conjure up the idea of a Catholic monk, or a Eastern religion monk, Hindu, that kind of thing. But a very, very loosely defined in the charismatic church. Like, we were chatting yesterday at lunch, or just chatting yesterday. We were having a snack. And I was curious from your perspective, because I know from my perspective that the whole idea of a vocation of someone being called into monasticism was so foreign to my upbringing in the church. I was curious what your take on that was, or what the Anglican Church would think. And then it was not something that we talked about yesterday, but does the Anglican Church have monasteries? Because the Evangelical Church doesn't. We would have retreat centers that people would go to and could organize some time away to, but there wouldn't necessarily be, like typically in a monastery, you would have some kind of rhythm, order of service, liturgy, that kind of thing that you're entering into, and some work that you could probably participate in. The retreat centers wouldn't really do that. You might be able to book some time there, but there wouldn't necessarily be some kind of rhythm that you'd be entering into.
Right.
So there's just a very different. If there was one of the things that we would have, maybe not division in how we understand it, but in terms of church practices, I think the idea of a vocational monastic would be definitely one of them, where the portion of the church that I come from would go, that makes no sense to us.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, for us, to a degree, it would, I think when we're talking about kind of the average Anglican congregation, or for most people, if I was a congregant here in the parish and I suddenly came forward and said, no, I feel really called to become a monk, most people would probably assume that I'm going to convert to Roman Catholicism.
Okay. Right.
But
Interesting.
it does exist in the Anglican world. There are Anglican monasteries. There's a big one outside of Boston, called the Society of St. John the Divine, I think, or the Monastery of St. John the Divine, the Cowley Fathers. But and they are brothers who live together, are celibate, in community,
right.
and they're quite well known. They do a lot of stuff online, and it's a big retreat center, but not to the degree do those things exist that they would in the Orthodox, the Roman Catholic world. And so it would be a bit strange, for us to say that. Now, there are kind of these don't know what the right term would be. I mean, they are monastic orders, but they're often people who are not. I don't want to say lay monastic orders, but people become members of these devotional societies, and they can take vows and become brothers or sisters of the society, and live according to a rule of life and an order, but not live in a kind of cloistered community. So people who would still feel a vocation to be serving in a parish or having a family and that kind of thing. In the Franciscan order, they'd be called third order Franciscans. So they're not monks in a monastery. They're
Right.
actually people who live outside of it but are still bound by a certain rule. So those things exist. They have, I think, are more a result of the kind of late 19th century and 20th century. Around the time of the English Reformation, when the Anglican Church or the English Church was kind of coming into more of what we know today. There was something called the dissolution of the monasteries, where
Right.
Henry VIII dissolved all these monasteries and kind of took them apart in England. And so whatever might have existed and carried on in Anglican form from our Catholic past in England was taken apart, and that never happened. But so there's been a kind of resurgence, of these things in the last 150, 200 years. So it is part of our landscape, but it's not a major part of it. But that brings me to another thing I want to talk about, is that one of the reasons that it, in a way, it's not as big of a thing to have monasteries is because I think, and there's other scholars, well, I'm not a scholar, but there are scholars that I read that think so, that Anglicanism actually, in our kind of DNA and in the makeup of our worship, it is actually fundamentally a monastic kind of spirituality. And there's a really great writer named Martin Thornton, who an English guy, you can find lots online, who wrote a book called English Spirituality, and it's really all about trying to kind of define, what is unique about English Anglican spirituality. And what he found was that how heavily influenced it is by the Benedictine tradition. So, and the way we see that, I mean, I'm gonna make a plug for it almost every episode. But here's my copy of the Book of Common Prayer. I knew you have one.
Hey, I've got one. I've got one I use almost every day. Yeah,
good.
Although I use it, I'll probably, if you saw how I used it,
I'd be horrified.
You might be horrified. I go like, here, watch. I'll show you for a sec. Here's my Book of Common Prayer. Okay. Yeah. And here is all the prayers.
Yep.
Right. And I go, okay, let me get through all the prayers. Where's the Psalms? Okay, here's the Psalms. All right, there we go. I got to the meat of it.
That's right. Well, if you turn to the page in your Book of Common Prayer, LVI, which is 56, right before page 1, you'll see that on that page, in the facing page, it says in order for morning prayer daily throughout the year. And the little fine text over here are called the rubrics. And the rubrics are really, the little text tells you what you're supposed to do, and the big text is what you're supposed to say. And so the very first thing under general rubrics there on page 56, it says all priests and deacons, unless prevented by sickness or other urgent cause, are to say daily the morning and evening prayer, either privately or openly in the church. Now, that's a pretty monastic thing to do.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? To have a structured order set of prayers that are said daily that we are bound to do. And I think it even says that in the latter case, it's desirable that the bell should be rung in order that the people may come to take part, or at least lift up their hearts to God in the midst of their occupation, whatever they're doing. So I mean, so much of I think what it means to be an Anglican, if you're following this kind of life of prayer that we find in there, is in a way to kind of live monastically. You're not, well, I'm bound to certain vows, but you're not in a cloistered way, but in your spiritual and prayer life, it is kind of called to be a monastic. And I guess I'm kind of interested too, and I know part of what we're talking about is, is there a place for that within the church today? Right, because a lot of people are going to say, as they do for other denominations, will say, well, monasticism in the monastery sense, in the sense of going out into this, living apart from the world, either as a hermit or in a community. I've heard people say, well, that's selfish, right? Why do those people kind of disconnect from everything and go have this life? I think when you actually examine the way they live, most people would not prefer that to to the way we live,
Right.
But I mean, that's a criticism that people have of it. But then, is there a place for that? But then is there also a place for, I think, the kind of monasticism that people like you and I, or people in the pews can enter into and live out in our spiritual lives?
Well, that's a great question. What I think, well, first, before we get there, hold that thought,
Yeah.
because that it is, I absolutely want to address that, because you kind of have to parse out how people think, from my perspective anyway, how people would think about monasticism.
Sure.
And so what I want to do is just make quickly share
A word from our sponsors.
We have coming up in November an online seminar that I'm doing. Colin, you may be on there. I have no idea if you'd be on there.
Wow. Okay.
But this is something we're hosting through Win Ministries, where we're talking about what the voices have said, the voices of people that went to the desert to find God, what they have said about the rhythm of the spiritual life, how they discovered God, and what they can tell us about today. So we're doing this online seminar called Voices from the Desert, November 13th and 14th through Win Ministries. It'll be myself and my dad, Ken Hoffert, who I'm on with him every Friday night doing dream interpretation from a Christian biblical perspective. So we're going to be doing this November 13th and 14th, talking about how to discover God, how to slow down our lives, how to engage with God, and really exploring the teachings that have helped people find a rich connection with the heart of God throughout Christian history. So that's coming up November 13th and 14th. If you're interested in that, the link to information about that is in the description. There is a small cost associated with the seminar, Friday night, and then an all-day Saturday thing. And so the link is in the description. You can click on that and check it out on your own time. So, okay, back to our conversation. If you have questions about that, by the way, post in the comments. And if you have questions about what we're talking about, living this alone, set-apartedness, this life to God, please comment in the description. So, in response to this, is there a place for monasticism, or this idea of retreat, or even pilgrimage? Really is really what it was looked at. Pilgrimage into the desert became an analogy throughout Christian history of pilgrimage through the heart to discover God, and the desert really became a metaphor for the heart. It wasn't just that you needed to go to the desert every time. That kind of, as the understanding of discovering God in seasons of being set apart developed and matured, there was different ways of thinking about it. But in our present day, I think we kind of have to parse things out just a little bit. Like you had said, if someone was to come forward to you in the Anglican Church and say, I want to become a monk, you would probably maybe assume that they wanted to go become Roman Catholic. And see, people, I realize now, having been through read a lot of the monastic works throughout Christian history, that from the evangelical standpoint, the idea of living, well, I guess here's what I'm trying to say. Based on what you said, I feel like I'm talking in circles. Based on what you said, you are under vow to offer a morning and an evening prayer, and that the practice of Anglican spirituality is inherently monastic. See, from coming from the outside in and peering into monasticism, that does not sound monastic to me at all from the outside in. Right. However, knowing what I know now about the rhythm of Christian monasticism, I understand exactly what you're saying. And I go, oh, because when evangelicals, we would separate the times of set-apartedness to seek God from the rhythm of seeking him. Let me explain that a little bit. We've talked about especially if you're on the YouTube channel, or go to the YouTube channel, we had a episode where we talked about the function of our space in churches. When it comes to our gatherings, in the Evangelical Church, we don't gather like your morning and evening prayer. You would gather, and that when it's not for the people,
Right.
your gathering isn't. Your gathering is not oriented around people being there and people being ministered to. That's a benefit of it, and that's what happens. But when you gather, you're gathering to offer prayers to God, to serve communion at certain, the Eucharist at certain times. Yeah, but a lot of it is oriented around we're offering something to God that pleases Him on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And see, when we gather in the Evangelical Church, we don't gather for that reason.
It has nothing to do with God. It's all
it has, well, it doesn't have
it.
You understand what I mean? That when we gather, our thought process is we're gathering to be taught from the Word,
right,
to offer worship to God, and to engage in community life. There's not like if nobody showed up to the church, the pastor wouldn't still preach the sermon.
Right.
It would just be like, oh, okay, well, no one came today.
Yeah.
It would be that's what I mean. It's a fundamentally different understanding. So to say that is there a place for monasticism? That when the evangelical hears that, they hear, is there a place to go and be alone and set aside time for an extended period of time to God? That's what we hear. And so part of me goes, well, yeah, absolutely. There's a place for Christian retreat, regardless of the strain of Christianity, to set time aside to seek God, whether that's a day, whether that's even an hour, whether that's a month, a week, a year, whatever it is. There's obviously time set aside to do that. But within the evangelical framework, is there a way to incorporate a vocational monastic into the church? That would be very difficult.
Yeah.
As opposed to, you could probably, if someone came to you and said, I want to be a monastic and I want to be involved with St. Mary's or St. John's, it may be a difficult thing for you to wrap your head around actually doing it. But, you could see, well, they could be involved in this, they could be involved in this. There'd be a liturgical involvement all the time. And it would really just look like either the person coming and working in the office of a church, or coming on Sunday and being involved in
helping too.
on Sunday.
It makes me think one of our earlier episodes was with the Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
Yes.
And that's they're for those who don't know, they're a Roman Catholic order of nuns who recently, within the last few years, moved to Summerside.
Yeah.
And I remember this because having been raised Roman Catholic, I had two great aunts that were nuns, and we would go when we were in my mom's church in her village in Cape Breton. There were nuns, not my great aunts, but in that village that would always be at church. Whenever we were there, they had their own pew, and I think the nuns here in town, one of the ways that they are involved with the congregation is that they visit people in the hospital. So I'll go into the hospital, once or twice a week, and I put my name in a book, and I'll put my name and I'll say, well, it says number of people visited. And I'll say, well, 2. And you'll see one of the sisters above, number of people visited, 48 people or something like that. Right. They're just spending all this time visiting people and praying for them. And so, I mean, that's the kind of thing, I think, for those who may be unaware that, the way that monastics that aren't cloistered in monasteries apart from society, the way that they are, at present integrated and participating in the life of churches, not so much Anglican churches as much, but Roman Catholic churches certainly, and to a degree Orthodox churches, even though I think they tend to be a bit more cloistered.
Right.
But often, like the one in Nova Scotia, they'll act as places of retreat for people from the churches to go and enter into that life. But really, you're entering in there. In that case, you're entering into a life that you're not living. Like you step into their world that is sort of going on every day.
That's definitely how it feels.
Yeah.
That's the thing where, so for the Evangelical Church, vocationally speaking, you're talking about someone that's doing what you've just described would be a what's the word I'm looking for? A chaplain.
Right. Yeah.
And that would be, the chaplain goes and visits people in the hospital. If they're a chaplain that's signed up with the hospital, it wouldn't necessarily be thought of. A pastor could vocationally do that if people are part of their congregation, they would go do that. But they're probably not going to go just visit 48 people, 46 people. They're just going to go visit people in their congregation. And there's not necessarily a way of thinking within the evangelical church that says, if you thought your call, I don't even think anybody raised in the evangelical church would think my call is into monasticism and would ever even think about trying to find their way within the evangelical church to that. Just because there is value for prayer, rhythm, fasting, all those kind of things that are central to the monastic life, but we would have to divorce the rhythm of community life from the practice of solitary life in order to do the two. They wouldn't be married together like they are in a monastery. I remember probably a year and a half ago, I went and visited to spend just 3 days as a spiritual retreat down to the Catholic monastery down in Nova Scotia in Rogersville. And one of the things that struck me was that these people don't care if anybody comes. This is the rhythm of their life. And it was such a foreign. I mean, I loved the beauty of the building, the architecture. The library was amazing. Just read and prayed and studied and attended services the whole time. And I even took communion. Don't tell anybody. You're not supposed to do that. Well, it depends, I guess, on the place.
I hope there's no Roman authority figures watching.
Yeah, that's here. Right. I'll be struck dead. And so it just struck me how the approach was fundamentally different. And so I don't even know if there'd be a way to incorporate something into an evangelical routine or a charismatic routine or Pentecostal or Baptist or whatever. Because so much of the gathering. So if we were to do gatherings throughout the week, the gathering throughout the week would focus on ministering to the needs of the people. That it would just be the entire focus. Like you might have a house group, you might have a Bible study, you might have a night of worship, you might come together and pray, but there's really not necessarily a formal format to how that would happen. And so you're not entering into something ongoing as opposed to coming alongside people and praying for a short period of time.
Yeah.
So I just don't see how it would happen practically in the classical sense of a monastic. I think there's ways, especially in the last probably 30 years or so, there's been a large advent of intern type programs within many, especially larger evangelical churches. And there may be something to that. Living, you have something like a live-in program where you're eating together, you're living together, you're serving together.
Intentional community is the word that kind of comes to mind.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, it would be something like that. So I could see finding, and I think someone who felt that call to some kind of quote unquote higher form of spiritual life, if you want to call it that, that's probably how they would try and go about getting involved with that. And honestly, for me, I came to Canada to be involved with a ministry that was like that, living in community together, being taught, growing, praying, all this kind of stuff. And so had I been raised in, say, an Orthodox church or a Catholic church or even an Anglican church, I may have at that point in my life said, I think there's a call either to seminary or to be a priest, or I may have legitimately gone, I might want to go explore the idea of being a monk at that point. But that concept just doesn't exist growing up in the evangelical church.
Right. I think too, one of the key aspects, because one of the other questions we were going to talk about today is, what is the benefit of monasticism? Because it kind of rotates or comes back on that criticism that people will sometimes have. I keep looking at the screen because I want to look at, I feel like I want to converse with you, but then
I know it's a hard one to figure out.
It's weird. But that criticism that it is inherently selfish for people to kind of run off and do this.
Right.
My rebuttal to something like that would be you know, it's not an easy life. It's not like these people are running off to something comfortable and
Right.
just checking out from all the woes that we have to go through. But you know, part of the rebuttal would be, well, actually, I mean, what they're doing for us is that gives me comfort to think that there are people that have given up their lives to spend time in like daily ceaseless prayer
Yeah.
for the world, you
Yeah.
know. And I think that in a way is and I think we see this in the Desert Fathers too, you know, that really the whole point of moving away from city life, from all the kind of rigors that you go through in daily life, and retreating into a cave or a fort or the desert or whatever,
Right.
um you know, is to be able to free oneself from the distractions that keep you from that constant prayer. Now, we know from
Right.
them that there, you know, there's all kinds of other dangers that you face in the desert that you may not in the city. Once you're free of the sort of worldly distractions, there's spiritual things that can assault you, and
Yeah.
and they often deal with that. But fundamentally, monasticism, I think, is, in terms of monastics that go to a certain place, you know, rather than just trying to live a rhythm in your own life, is about trying to free yourself from certain distractions to just pray ceaselessly. That
Right.
gives me comfort,
Yeah.
and I think that is a benefit of that. You know, where say people say, well, what's the purpose of them nowadays? And I say, well, I don't know. We don't seem much much better off. So, you know, in the world, we certainly need prayer, and it gives me comfort to know that they're there doing this and praying,
Yeah.
and those that serve you know, in a charitable way, if that's the call on their order, or teach, or visit hospitals or whatever. I mean, there's that too, these added benefits. But yeah.
Yeah. You know, there's a quote from, are you familiar with A.W. Tozer?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
He's probably more in my my wheelhouse.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about, I'm trying to see if I can pull it up really quick. I don't know if I have it just offhand. I think it's in his book, The Knowledge of God. And let's just see if I can, because it just goes alongside with what you're saying. And I think probably where we would find an answer to that question.
Right.
And I can't find it offhand. He's talking about what ails the church today, and what the proper response is, or what would fix or what would bring some answer to what ails the church.
Right.
And basically what he says is what is missing from the church is people that are willing to lay their life down and pierce the veil and report back what they heard or what they saw. Essentially seeing God and then coming back and saying, this is what I found in seeing him. And so just thinking of that, and I think that's an absolutely, I would absolutely agree with that, is there's too much interest in building a platform, in building a ministry, in my context, right? There's too much emphasis on that, and making a name and putting out all the books and making sure everybody listens and all of that kind of stuff, having a message, all of that. And Tozer's simple words, that we need people that know God and that teach us about how to know him and come back and tell us. And so when looking at the benefit and the place, and I know just in my studies too, that learning from people that have gone before and have credibly, and using our term, credibly encountered the heart of God, and then have come back and said, this is how I did it here. And not to create a formal system, in the sense of these are all the steps to take, but here's the parameters to place within your life. Right. I'm hesitating to say that because I also know you've got rule of life and Benedictine versus Cassian's writings in the early church and stuff like that, that there was some formal, I'm not saying that there's not formal principles to how you enact that.
Right.
But I mean, I think God, we come to a place where we learn or glean something from the time we spend alone with God that helps us say, here, this is my life as a signpost, and here's some of the ways I got there, and here's some of the ways I think you could get there. And I've had the benefit of being impacted by people I think lived that. And I just personally, people that I've known, people that I still know. And then I've had the benefit, of course, of studying and reading authors that I think have done that.
Right.
And so when I say, I'm not saying to walk back the need for some kind of format to follow. I think that's absolutely true. But the format doesn't get you there. It's the pursuit of the heart that gets you there.
Right.
That touch of the spirit of the presence of God that gets you there. Like David saying, I'm seeking your face. I'm not just instituting rhythm to institute rhythm for rhythm's sake, but seeking your face. I like Simon Nilsson. I don't know if you've seen the comment there. A tree, he said, the Celtic monks prayed alone, but also formed communities and were also missionaries. Absolutely true. And he said a tree needs deep roots. And I think there's a need for people that have pierced God and come back and tell us what they found.
And that's the best. I mean, the best of all the spiritual work we have from the last 2,000 years, 1,700 years. So much of it has come out of the monastery.
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, in our case, this whole podcast is really about what has come out of the desert. But so much after that too. You're getting these profound insights and deep contemplation from people who have gone into the solitude, of the cell, the monastic cell of the monastery, and come out having encountered God, but then had this to share for us, the people who aren't in there, because it is a calling too. I mean, of course, people are called to that kind of life the way that some are called to be pastors and others not. I think we can live certain kinds of principles to aid us in our spiritual lives, whether we're called to that particular life or not. But it is always good to remember too that we're not all called to be monks, in a very specific and particular way, or monastics.
But we can all, and then with that said, we can just like not every person is called to be a priest, but they can learn from things that a priest does.
For sure.
And so there's things we glean from the lives of the monastics, and so I think there's still a place today, and maybe even more of a place than ever today, trying to figure out ways. I mean, what's the balance? And this is a totally other conversation, but what's the balance between the advent of things like YouTube that we're live streaming on, and the benefit that could be to the world to learn some of the things from. Can you imagine if the monks in Mount Athos in Greece did a weekly podcast? I would like, that would be amazing. Actually, I've never even looked. I should look. That would be incredible.
You might be eating crow in a couple of minutes finding out.
That's right. But just to learn and be able to glean from people that have gone on that journey of knowing God. And again, we've talked about this. I feel like part of the call of my life is to help people find that way and point in that way. Yeah. And I think that's probably, you would probably agree that in one part of the vocation of a priest is to do that as well.
For sure. Yeah. Well, we're coming up on 40 minutes. So
yes, we are. Let me just do one more. Take a look at we have this online seminar coming up, Voices from the Desert, Discovering God in Our Hectic World. The link to information about that is on the video description. It's on the Wind Ministries website. We have that coming up November 13th and 14th. It'll be myself, Joshua, and my father are doing this. We're talking about how the historical church found God in really unique ways that transformed their lives, and then in turn caused their lives to be places of transformation for others. And so we'll be talking about that Friday. It's a Friday night all day. Saturday, there's a small fee associated with the seminar. But we're really just hoping that we can help people navigate what it looks like in this crazy, hectic world we live in 2020, to discover what it means to follow God and to live as Paul said, in him we live and move and have our being. So how do we discover that place of living, moving, and having our being in him, and not be totally turned upside down when things happen like 2020 has been. Not that you're not going to be turned upside down, but if you find your being in God, it's a lot easier to maintain consistency.
For sure.
So that's coming up. Click the link in the description of the video on YouTube and Facebook, and you can find some more information about that. So look forward to seeing you guys on that one.
Yeah. And thank you to everyone who's taken the time to be with us today as we did this, and comments and likes and shares. I haven't even really looked to see, but thank you. And if you're watching afterwards, thanks for watching, and drop a comment, a like, share, subscribe, hit the bell. I don't even know what we're supposed to say anymore, all that stuff, but do all that anyway, and help us out. And we appreciate the support we've been receiving. We hit 1,000 downloads on our audio podcast.
I know. Awesome.
Yeah, that was great. So thanks everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next Friday.
That's right. Next Friday.
Cool.